It was one of those nights when the city never seemed to rest. New York shimmered under the rain, silver lights dripping down glass towers, horns echoing through the wet streets, the hum of a world too busy to notice its own loneliness. On the top floor of a 50-story building, a man sat alone in a penthouse worth more than most people would earn in 10 lifetimes. His name was Edward Kane, a billionaire known for his cold precision, his sharp suits, and his even sharper tongue. Everything in his life was measured: time, money, reputation. But lately, there was one thing he couldn't measure anymore: peace. He had built companies that spanned continents, commanded thousands of employees, and owned homes that touched clouds. And yet, when the rain fell against the window, he always felt small, trapped in a room too large for one soul. His dinner table was set for 6, but only one plate was ever used. He had chefs, but preferred takeout. Maybe it reminded him of the few years before the fortune, when food was simpler, and joy wasn't something he had to buy. Down below, at a fast food chain glowing red and yellow against the rain, Ethan Morales zipped his jacket and checked the delivery app on his phone. Order number 4072. Address: Kane Tower, Penthouse 51. He sighed, wiping the fog off his helmet. Another long ride, another delivery, but each one mattered. Every dollar he earned went into caring for his mother and keeping his small food charity alive. Bread for Souls, a weekend project that fed homeless families across the city. Ethan didn't complain about his job. He saw it as training. Every meal he delivered was a prayer in motion. And even when customers were rude, he smiled. Because kindness wasn't a reaction, it was a decision. At 8:43 p.m., he arrived at Kane Tower. The doorman barely looked at him, just waved him toward the elevator, as if deliveries were something the building tolerated, not welcomed. Ethan adjusted the warm paper bag in his hands and stepped inside the elevator. 51 floors up, each ding echoing the climb between two worlds: the man who owned everything, and the one who carried it to his door. When the elevator doors opened, the air changed. Silence, marble, and money. The kind of silence that judges you. Ethan found the door marked Penthouse Kane. He took a breath, wiped the rain off his jacket, and knocked twice. Edward opened the door himself. No smile, no greeting. Just a scowl. "You're late," he said. Ethan checked his phone. "Actually, sir, it's right on time." Edward didn't answer. He snatched the bag, ripped it open, and frowned. "This isn't what I ordered." Ethan leaned forward politely. "It's a double cheeseburger with no onions, large fries, and—" "I said no pickles," Edward interrupted. "There are pickles." Ethan hesitated. "I can get a replacement right away." "It'll take 15 minutes. "I don't have 15 minutes. I have a meeting with Tokyo in 10. He threw the sandwich back in the bag like it had offended him personally. Ethan tried again, keeping his tone steady. "I can fix this. No need to pay for the wrong order." Edward's voice cut through the air. "I don't care about the money. It's about competence, something your generation clearly can't deliver." He pulled out his wallet, took out a $100 bill, and dropped it to the floor. "There's your tip," he said coldly. "Pick it up." The sound of the bill hitting marble echoed like thunder. Ethan froze for a second. The humiliation burned hot in his chest, but he forced his hands to stay still. He knelt slowly, picked up the bill, folded it carefully, and said quietly, "May your hunger never be greater than your pride." Edward smirked. "Cute line. Maybe try poetry instead of fast food next time." Ethan gave a small nod, turned, and walked away without another word. The elevator doors closed between them, the hum of steel swallowing the tension. Inside the penthouse, Edward muttered to himself, "Pathetic," as he tossed the bag onto the counter. He sat down at the dining table, unwrapped the sandwich, and took a bite anyway. The pickles were there, sharp, sour, intrusive, just like his thoughts. For some reason, the food tasted different tonight. Empty. He chewed, staring at the rain outside. His reflection stared back, tired eyes behind expensive glass. He tried to focus on the meeting waiting on his laptop screen, but the words blurred. The numbers meant nothing. The silence grew loud. He glanced at the crumpled paper bag on the counter. The words, "Thank you for your order," printed across the top, felt like a joke. A sudden ache gripped his chest, tight, then sharper. He pressed his hand over his heart, gasping. The room spun. The glass of wine slipped from his fingers, shattering across the floor, red spilling like warning lights. He stumbled toward the phone, but the distance between the table and the counter suddenly felt like miles. He collapsed to his knees. His breath came in short, broken bursts. The lights above blurred into halos. In the reflection of the window, he saw his own face, pale, desperate, afraid. The city outside kept moving, completely unaware that its king was falling. And somewhere below, a delivery man named Ethan Morales was wiping rain from his visor, ready to take another order. He didn't know yet that the next life he would deliver wasn't food, it was mercy. Morning came gray and silent. The rain had stopped, but the city still carried its aftertaste, puddles shining like glass, air thick with exhaustion. Edward Kane sat in the same chair he had fallen into the night before. His laptop glowed in front of him, numbers crawling across the screen, meaningless and endless. He barely slept. Every bite of that sandwich still felt like vinegar in his throat. But what truly soured him wasn't the food, it was the thought of being disrespected by someone beneath him. To Edward, success was built on hierarchy. There were builders and there were servants, and he was never meant to be the latter. He opened the delivery app, scrolled until he found the name, Ethan Morales. For a long second, he hovered over the rate delivery option. Then, with a smirk, he pressed 1 star. No comment, no explanation. Just a quiet declaration of contempt. Meanwhile, across town, Ethan stood outside the small food pantry that served as the headquarters of Bread for Souls. A few volunteers carried boxes of bread and fruit inside, preparing for the weekend's food drive. Ethan smiled as he helped an older woman with her cart. "Be careful with the stairs, Mrs. Benson," he said. "These boxes are heavier than they look." She laughed softly. "You always show up, don't you?" He shrugged. "Some people build walls, Mrs. B. I just try to build tables." Inside, the place smelled of hope. Fresh bread, coffee, laughter. Ethan's mother sat by the window, wrapping sandwiches for tomorrow's delivery. Her hands moved slowly, but her eyes still carried that old spark. "Long night, son?" Ethan nodded, forcing a smile. "Just another rude customer, nothing new," she chuckled. "Then forgive him already. The world's heavy enough without your anger." He kissed her forehead. "I know, Mom, I know." That same morning, Edward stormed into his office in Midtown Manhattan. Employees straightened in their seats as he passed, the atmosphere freezing like glass in his presence. He barked orders, corrected presentations, dismissed suggestions with a flick of his hand. To him, control meant safety, and safety meant never appearing weak. But deep down, beneath the crisp suit and polished watch, there was something restless, a whisper he didn't want to hear. It sounded a lot like guilt. At lunch, one of his assistants entered nervously. "Sir, the PR team said the donation proposal for the homeless shelter. Cancel it," Edward cut in. "No point wasting money on feel-good projects. The world doesn't run on charity." He leaned back in his chair, sipping espresso like it was armor. The world runs on performance. On results. People like that delivery boy? They'll never understand it. The assistant nodded, lips pressed tight, then left the room quietly. Outside, she exhaled, relieved to escape the chill of his presence. Hours passed. The city dimmed again. And as night settled, Edward's world shrank back to silence, just him, his glass walls, and his reflection. He opened the window slightly. The sound of the rain returning filled the room. For a second, he thought about calling someone, anyone, but there was no one left. Not since the divorce. Not since his son stopped answering calls. Not since success replaced every real human face in his life. He sat at the table and poured himself another drink. The glass clinked softly against the marble, echoing in the emptiness. "People like him," he muttered, "should be grateful I even ordered from them." He took a sip, then another. The bitterness lingered longer than the alcohol. Far below the city skyline, Ethan climbed onto his bike again. Rain trickled down his jacket, the plastic bag with another order strapped to the back. He didn't know it, but his route that night would lead him back to the same tower. Back to the same man. Back to the place where pride was about to meet mercy. The sky thundered softly as if heaven itself was taking a deep breath. Edward leaned over the counter, typing a message to his assistant when the pain returned. Sharp, sudden, unforgiving. He froze. The glass slipped from his hand and shattered. The same sound as the night before, but louder, closer. He tried to breathe, but air refused to come. His hand trembled, reaching for the phone again. The same distance, the same marble floor. The same mistake, believing he was untouchable. The phone slipped from his grip. His vision blurred. And in that spinning world of light and shadow, the last thing he saw before collapsing was the reflection of his own hand reaching out, but this time, no one there to take it. Down on the street, Ethan stopped at a red light. He adjusted his helmet, shivered from the cold, and glanced up. In the distance, a single window on the 51st floor flickered strangely, light flashing, then fading, then flashing again. He frowned. Something didn't feel right. The city kept moving, cars, people, umbrellas, lives. But somewhere above them, a man who had everything was learning, for the first time, what it meant to lose control. And somewhere below, the same man he had humiliated was about to carry grace up 51 floors to a stranger who once threw his pride at his feet. The lights of the city bled through the glass walls of Edward's penthouse, painting thin streaks of gold across the floor. Outside, the rain returned, soft, rhythmic, almost forgiving. Inside, everything was still. Too still. Edward Kane sat alone at his marble counter, staring at the untouched meal in front of him. The same burger he'd thrown onto the table hours ago. The same wine glass, half full, beside it. Cold food, warm pride. A feast with no appetite. He pushed the plate away and loosened his tie. The silence pressed against him like another wall. He'd once loved silence. It meant control. But tonight, it felt like judgment. He poured another drink. The ice clinked against the glass, sharp and lonely. He took a slow sip, then leaned back in his chair, letting the liquid burn down his throat. The city outside pulsed like a living thing. Millions of people moving, breathing, loving, struggling. And here he was, a man who had conquered the world, unable to conquer the emptiness in his own chest. He reached for his phone. No new messages, no calls. He scrolled through his contacts, names he'd once depended on, now just numbers that led nowhere. He hovered over one name, his son, Daniel. He hadn't spoken to him in 3 years. Not since the argument, the one that ended with slammed doors and words neither could take back. Edward had built a wall so high between them, even guilt couldn't climb over it. He started to type a message. "Hey Daniel, I've been thinking," but he stopped halfway, deleted it, and tossed the phone aside. He poured another drink. This time, the pour was longer. And when the glass touched his lips, the taste felt heavier, not alcohol, but regret. The pain came suddenly. A sharp twist beneath his ribs, spreading like fire across his chest. He gasped, gripping the counter for balance. At first, he thought it was just stress. Then came the second wave, harder, crueler. He stumbled backward, clutching his chest, eyes wide. The glass slipped from his hand and shattered across the floor. Red wine spilled out. staining the marble like blood. He tried to speak, but only air escaped. Each breath was a battle, each second louder than the last. He fell to his knees. The room spun, the chandelier above him dissolving into a blur of light. He crawled toward his phone. It had fallen a few feet away, screen glowing faintly. The distance looked small, but to him it was a desert. He reached out, trembling fingers brushing the edge of it. Then another wave hit. This time, it stole the air completely. His body froze. He collapsed sideways, the world dimming at the edges. Time slowed. The rain outside grew louder, as if heaven itself had leaned closer, listening. The city went on as usual. Cars, sirens, people laughing below. No one knew that the man who owned half of it was dying quietly above them. The digital clock on the counter blinked. 11:57 p.m., 3 minutes before midnight. 3 minutes before the next delivery in the system. 3 minutes before Grace would find its way back to his door. Somewhere down the street, Ethan Morales parked his motorcycle under an awning. He checked his phone for the next address. It was another order, a small apartment, 2 blocks away from the tower. He looked up through the drizzle, watching the skyline pulse in the distance. He had no reason to go back to that building, no plan, no expectation. But something about that night felt off, a tug in his chest, a quiet instinct that whispered, "Go back." He hesitated for a moment, then strapped his helmet tighter. His mother's words echoed in his mind. "Listen when your heart moves. Ethan, that's usually where God speaks." He started the engine and turned back toward Kane Tower. Upstairs, Edward's breaths grew shallow. His hand twitched against the cold floor. Every second stretched into eternity. Memories flashed like lightning. His first deal, his first million, his wedding day, his son's laughter when he was small. Then the memories grew darker. Faces of employees he'd fired, voices he'd silenced, the echo of laughter that wasn't joy but mockery. He saw himself dropping the money to the floor, saw the young man's calm eyes staring back, and heard those words again. "May your hunger never be greater than your pride." They rang louder than the thunder outside. And for the first time, he understood what they meant. The elevator doors opened 51 floors below. Ethan stepped out, dripping rainwater onto the marble floor. The night guard frowned. "Back again?" Ethan nodded. "Yeah, I think something's wrong upstairs. Can I check?" The guard hesitated. "No one called down." "I know, but I just feel like I should." The man sighed. "Fine. If anyone asks, I didn't see you." Ethan smiled gratefully and pressed the button. The elevator doors closed. He glanced at the panel. 51 floors again, the same as before. But this time, the delivery wasn't food, it was destiny. Inside the penthouse, the lights flickered once, then steadied. The rain hit harder against the glass. Edward lay motionless, his phone buzzing faintly inches away. He couldn't move. He couldn't speak. But inside the silence, he could still hear a voice, not his own. A whisper, almost like a memory. Gentle but unmistakable. "All the towers in the world can't touch heaven. And heaven always bends lower for the humble." A single tear slid from the corner of his eye, falling onto the marble beside him. He didn't know if it was regret or surrender, maybe both. Then, through the blur of lights, a sound faint but real. Footsteps. The door opening. Someone calling his name. Grace had arrived. The elevator hummed as it rose, cutting through 50 floors of silence. Inside, Ethan stood still, his reflection trembling faintly on the mirrored walls. Each passing number on the panel glowed like a heartbeat. 47, 48, 49. He didn't know why he was going back. He just knew he had to. He clutched the small delivery bag in his hands, the last order of his night, now cold, forgotten. Something inside him whispered that this wasn't about food anymore. As the elevator reached the top, a strange stillness filled the air. When the doors slid open, he stepped out and froze. The hallway was dark. Only a faint light spilled from the half-open door at the end. He walked toward it slowly, his boots echoing against the marble floor. "Mr. Kane?" he called, his voice cautious. No answer. Just the sound of rain tapping against the glass. He pushed the door open. The penthouse was quiet, too quiet. The lights flickered, and then he saw it. A body sprawled on the floor near the counter, a phone glowing beside an outstretched hand. "Sir," he shouted, running forward. He knelt beside Edward, his fingers instinctively checking for a pulse. Faint, weak, but there. "Come on, stay with me," Ethan murmured. He turned the man carefully onto his back, loosened his tie, and tilted his head back to clear the airway. Then he began chest compressions, steady, rhythmic, his voice counting softly under his breath. He had learned CPR during his nursing classes at community college. He never imagined he'd use it here, in a room worth millions, on the man who had thrown his dignity on the floor hours ago. But mercy doesn't wait for apologies. It acts, even when the world doesn't deserve it. "Come on," Ethan whispered. 1, 2, 3. He breathed, pressed again, listened. Nothing. He pressed harder. Rain hammered against the windows, as if heaven itself was keeping time. Edward's chest rose once, barely, then fell. Ethan grabbed his phone, dialing emergency services. "Cardiac arrest, 51st floor, Kane Tower." The operator's voice was calm, rehearsed, distant. "Ambulance on the way." "Keep compression steady." Ethan dropped the phone, focused. Sweat mixed with rain on his forehead. He counted again, each push a prayer, each breath a plea. Minutes passed like hours. Then, a gasp, weak, broken, but real. Edward's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and glassy. He tried to speak, but the words came out in fragments. "You, again?" Ethan nodded, still catching his breath. "Yeah, it's me." Edward blinked slowly, confusion bleeding into shame. I threw you out." Ethan's voice was steady. "Doesn't matter right now. Just breathe." He looked around for something to elevate the man's legs, grabbed a couch cushion, slid it beneath him. The sound of sirens began to grow faintly in the distance, rising through the rain. "Help's coming," Ethan said. "You'll be okay." Edward's lips trembled. "Why? Are you helping me?" Ethan paused for a moment, his eyes soft. "Because someone should." The paramedics burst through the door minutes later. Ethan guided them in, explaining what he'd done, the timing, the vitals. They moved fast, efficient, lifting Edward onto a stretcher, connecting monitors, oxygen masks, 4 lines. The apartment that once echoed with arrogance now hummed with the sound of teamwork and urgency. One of the paramedics looked at Ethan. "You saved him. If you hadn't found him when you did, he wouldn't have made it." Ethan nodded quietly, stepping back. He didn't smile. He just stared at the man on the stretcher, pale, weak, human. As they carried Edward toward the elevator, his hand brushed against Ethan's sleeve. Their eyes met, a second of fragile understanding between two men who'd met once as enemies. Edward's lips moved, barely a whisper. "Thank you." Ethan simply nodded. "Get better, sir." Then he turned away, watching as the doors closed behind them. The elevator descended, carrying the man who once stood above the world, now dependent on the hands he had despised. When the apartment fell silent again, Ethan exhaled and sat on the floor. The same marble where Edward had dropped the money hours before. Now it was wet with spilled wine and faint streaks of red, but this time it wasn't humiliation. It was redemption taking shape. He looked at the broken glass glinting near the counter and shook his head slowly. "Funny," he murmured. "The same floor where pride fell. Now smells like grace." He wiped his hands, picked up his helmet, and left quietly. No cameras. No applause. Just one man walking back into the rain, content that he'd done what was right, even for someone who hadn't. Downstairs, the paramedic's siren wailed into the night, cutting through the city noise. Ethan watched it fade into the distance, his reflection blinking faintly in the puddles beneath the streetlight. He whispered to himself, "Thank you for letting me be there in time." Then he started his motorcycle, the engine growling softly as he disappeared into the wet streets. Behind him, in that towering building of glass and wealth, a single light remained on. The light of a man who had fallen and was about to rise different. The world came back in fragments. A slow hum, a flicker of light, the faint scent of antiseptic. Edward Kane opened his eyes to a white ceiling. For a moment, he didn't know where he was. Then came the sound, the steady mechanical rhythm of a heart monitor. Beep, beep, life announcing itself, 1 second at a time. He turned his head. A nurse stood nearby, checking the chart at the foot of his bed. When she noticed he was awake, she smiled. "Good morning, Mr. Kane. You're safe." He blinked slowly. His throat was dry. "What happened?" "You had a cardiac episode," she said gently. "Lucky for you, someone found you just in time." He frowned weakly. "Who?" She hesitated for a second, then smiled again. "A young man. Delivery driver, I think. Said his name was Ethan Morales. Stayed until the ambulance took you. He saved your life." The name hit him like a quiet echo. Ethan Morales. The delivery man. He closed his eyes and leaned back, shame crawling up his chest faster than the pain. Images returned in flashes. The burger, the insult, the money hitting the floor. That calm voice saying, "May your hunger never be greater than your pride." Now that same man had carried him back from death. He turned his face away, tears stinging his eyes. The nurse didn't say anything. She just adjusted the blanket and whispered, "You should rest. You've been given a second chance." Then she placed something on his nightstand, a small note folded in half. "He left this for you." She smiled softly and left the room. Edward stared at the note for a long time before picking it up. His hands trembled as he unfolded the paper. The handwriting was simple, clean, almost childlike. "I hope you're okay, sir. Take care of yourself. Life doesn't give us many chances to start again." Ethan. There was nothing dramatic about it. No accusation, no lecture, just grace, written in ink. He held the note against his chest, and for the first time in years, he prayed. It wasn't polished, it wasn't loud, just a whisper. "God, I don't deserve this." Days passed. Each morning, the light through the hospital blinds grew warmer, but Edward couldn't shake the heaviness inside him. His body was healing. His heart, not yet. He stared at the ceiling, listening to the world move on without him. Assistants called. Lawyers emailed. Deals waited, but for the first time, he didn't care. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that night, the floor, the pain, and that young man's face leaning over him, breathing life back into the man who had thrown dignity to the ground. He wondered why Ethan had even come back. Why someone would help a person who humiliated them. And every time he tried to reason it out, his mind stopped at one word, forgiveness, a word he hadn't used in years. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the skyline, Edward sat up for the first time. Outside his window, the city glowed like fireflies against dusk. He thought about all the people moving out there, the ones he'd stepped over to climb higher, the ones he'd ignored while chasing numbers. He whispered, "I built everything," and became nothing. Then his eyes fell on the note again. He unfolded it carefully, running his finger over the words. A simple message from a simple man, and yet it carried more meaning than any contract he'd ever signed. The door opened softly. The same nurse peeked in. "You have a visitor request." Edward looked up, surprised. "Who?" She checked her clipboard. "No name. Just said he wanted to drop something off." Before he could answer, she stepped aside, and there he was. Ethan. He stood at the doorway, modest as ever, wearing the same delivery jacket, a paper bag in his hands. Inside was a warm sandwich and a small container of soup. Ethan smiled politely. Didn't know what you liked, so I brought something safe. Chicken soup. Edward just stared at him, lost for words. Ethan stepped closer, setting the bag down on the table. You don't need to say anything, he said softly. I just wanted to make sure you were okay. Edward's voice broke. Why? Ethan shrugged. Because you're human. And because once someone did the same for me. He smiled faintly, adjusting his jacket. My mom used to say, never let pride stop you from doing the right thing. I didn't understand it when I was younger. Now I do. Edward's eyes filled again. I don't know how to thank you. You already did, Ethan said. You're still breathing. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The room was quiet except for the sound of the monitor, steady, peaceful. Then Ethan reached for the doorknob. Take care, Mr. Kane, and if you ever want to do something good with your second chance, he smiled. You know where to find me. He left before Edward could respond. The door clicked softly behind him. Edward sat there for a long time, staring at the food on the table. He reached for the soup, opened the lid, and let the smell fill the room. Simple, warm, the kind of meal he hadn't tasted in years, not because he couldn't afford it, but because he'd forgotten what sincerity tasted like. He took a spoonful and whispered, maybe grace tastes like this. Outside, the city lights blinked alive again. But this time, they didn't look like trophies. They looked like prayers. The days passed slowly. The hospital had become a world of its own. White walls, quiet corridors, the smell of disinfectant mixed with fresh flowers. Each morning, Edward felt his body growing stronger, but his heart stayed heavy. He spent hours staring at the window, watching the city below move like an endless river of lights and strangers. People going somewhere, people with purpose. He wondered when he had stopped having one. His phone buzzed with messages from board members, investors, assistants. He ignored them all. He wasn't ready to face that world yet, not when he was still facing himself. One afternoon, the nurse rolled in a small TV on a stand. Some entertainment, she said kindly. Might help you pass the time, Edward nodded. He hadn't watched television in years. He'd been too busy owning networks, not watching them. He picked up the remote, flipped through the channels aimlessly. News, sports, stocks. Then, a familiar logo, NYC Community Spotlight. A reporter stood in front of a crowd in a small park, holding a microphone. Behind her, volunteers were serving food to dozens of people. Men, women, and children huddled under tents. He almost changed the channel until he saw a face he recognized. Ethan, the same delivery jacket. The same calm eyes. The same quiet smile. The reporter's voice carried through the room. Every Saturday, this young man and a group of volunteers gather to serve meals to those in need. They call it Bread for Souls. Today, they've reached a milestone minus 10,000 meals served across New York City. Edward's breath caught. He turned up the volume, leaning closer. On screen, Ethan laughed with a little boy, handing him a warm sandwich and a cup of soup. He looked so alive, so full of peace. It was a peace Edward had never known, not even with billions in his account. The reporter smiled. Ethan, you've inspired so many with your story. What keeps you doing this every week? Ethan wiped his hands on a napkin, looked at the camera, and said, because I know what it feels like to go hungry. Not just for food, for kindness, for purpose, for meaning. My mom taught me to never deny bread to anyone, even the ungrateful. Because everyone's starving for something. The words hit Edward like thunder. Never deny bread, even to the ungrateful. He turned off the volume, but the words kept echoing in the silence. He could still see Ethan's face on the frozen screen, smiling, serving, alive with something more powerful than success. It wasn't charity. It was love disguised as work. Grace wearing an apron. Edward sank back into his chair, his eyes glistening. His chest felt tight again, But this time not from pain, from realization. All his life, he had worshipped control. He believed that wealth gave him power, and power gave him worth. But looking at that screen, he understood. Ethan had neither wealth nor power, yet he was the richest man Edward had ever seen. The nurse walked in quietly. "Everything okay?" Edward nodded slowly. "Yeah. Just watching someone who's better at living than I ever was." She smiled. "That's Ethan Morales, right? He's become kind of famous lately. People say his group feeds hundreds every week, mostly with donations from other working people. No big sponsors, no corporate money. Just people helping people." Edward swallowed hard. "No corporate money?" She shook her head. "He refuses it. Says he wants to keep it pure, community-based. But they could really use support. They're expanding fast." He turned back to the screen as she left. The broadcast replayed Ethan's closing words. "You can't change the whole world, but you can change the world for someone." "That's enough," Edward whispered to himself. "I used to think that too, before I forgot." That night he couldn't sleep. He turned the lights off, but the glow of the city outside still painted his room. He closed his eyes, and instead of numbers or meetings, he saw Ethan's smile again, the look of a man at peace with his purpose. He heard the echo of his own cruelty, his own voice saying, "Pick it up," and Ethan's calm reply, "May your hunger never be greater than your pride." Now those words weren't an insult, they were prophecy. Around midnight, he stood up, slipped on his robe, and walked to the window. Rain streaked down the glass, turning the skyline into a watercolor of light and shadow. He whispered quietly, "God, what am I supposed to do with this?" The question hung in the air like smoke. He didn't expect an answer, but sometimes grace doesn't speak in thunder. It whispers through conviction, and in that silence he knew. He couldn't erase the past, but he could start building a future that fed something more than ego. The next morning, the nurse found him awake early, sitting upright, alert. "Feeling better today?" He smiled faintly. "Better than I deserve." He held the folded note from Ethan between his fingers. "I need to find someone," he said. "I think I owe him more than money." She nodded softly. "Then I hope you find him. You both deserve that." When the doctor cleared him for discharge, Edward looked around the hospital room one last time. He'd come in broken and unconscious. Now he was leaving humbled and awake. He folded the hospital blanket neatly, slipped the note into his jacket pocket, and whispered, "Thank you for not giving up on me." As he stepped outside, the sky had cleared. The sun broke through the clouds, lighting up the wet pavement below. And for the first time in decades, Edward Kane looked up at the sky and smiled. Not because he was powerful, not because he had survived, but because he finally understood what it meant to be saved. The car ride home was quiet. Too quiet. The driver tried to make small talk, but Edward barely responded. He just watched the city slide past his window. Buildings, crowds, lights. The same streets he had once ruled from above now looked unfamiliar. It was as if he had stepped into a world that had gone on without him. When the car stopped in front of Kane Tower, the doorman rushed forward, eager to please. "Mr. Kane, glad to see you back, sir. We heard about the—" Edward raised a hand gently. "It's fine. Thank you." The man nodded, stepping aside as Edward entered the lobby. The marble floors gleamed. The air smelled of money and control. And yet, something inside him recoiled. He used to love this place. Now it felt hollow, like walking through a museum of his own pride. When the elevator doors opened to his penthouse, he hesitated before stepping inside. The memory hit him like a punch. The broken glass, the sound of his own body hitting the floor, the coldness of the marble beneath his hands. He could still see the faint stain of red wine where it had spilled that night, a dark reminder of who he'd been. He stood there for a long time, staring. The apartment was spotless now, cleaned by staff while he was gone. but no amount of polish could erase what had happened in that room. He walked slowly to the counter and placed his hand on it, the same spot where he had fallen. His reflection stared back from the glossy surface, and for the first time, he couldn't look himself in the eye. He turned away, pacing through the silence. The city lights below blinked like 1,000 unspoken truths. He could still hear Ethan's voice, calm, forgiving. He could still see his mother's eyes in that TV interview, the gentleness, the faith. And he thought, that's the kind of wealth I never had. He sat on the couch and leaned forward, elbows on his knees. His hands trembled slightly. Not from weakness this time, but from the weight of realization. For years, he had measured success in numbers, as if profit could prove purpose. Now he saw how empty those numbers were, figures that couldn't buy meaning, digits that couldn't heal loneliness. He closed his eyes and remembered his son again, Daniel. It had been 3 years since they spoke. 3 years since that last fight, when Daniel had said, "Dad, you don't know how to love anyone who can't make you richer." At the time, Edward had called it disrespect. Now he saw it for what it was, truth. He reached for his phone, scrolled through his contacts until he found his son's name. He hovered over the call button, then stopped. He wasn't ready for forgiveness yet. Not until he learned how to give it first. That night he couldn't sleep. The city hummed below him, but his penthouse felt colder than ever. He walked through the hallways, rooms full of furniture that no one used, paintings worth millions that didn't move his heart anymore. He had built a palace and turned it into a prison. He stood by the window and whispered, "God, why me? Why save me?" The answer wasn't loud. It came in silence, in memory, in conviction. Maybe it wasn't about being saved. Maybe it was about being sent back to fix what he'd broken. The next morning, Edward woke up early. He didn't call his chauffeur, didn't put on a suit. He wore jeans and a plain shirt, clothes he hadn't worn in years. He walked to the elevator, pressed the ground floor, and stepped outside into the city air. People brushed past him, delivery riders, construction workers, street vendors. For the first time, he didn't see them as background. He saw them as souls, each carrying their own weight, each living stories he'd never cared to know. He bought a coffee from a street cart. The man behind the counter recognized him immediately. "Hey, aren't you Edward Kane, the finance guy?" Edward smiled faintly. "I used to be," the man laughed. "Used to be? That's funny." Edward took the cup, nodding. "Not really. Just honest." As he walked through the streets, he thought of Ethan's project, Bread for Souls. He had the address from the TV segment. A small community center in the Lower East Side. Nothing fancy. No logos. Just people feeding people. He stopped outside, watching from across the street. It was Saturday morning. A line of men and women stretched down the sidewalk, homeless, single mothers, kids with empty eyes. Volunteers handed out food, laughing softly, moving with purpose. And there he was, Ethan, smiling, serving, wiping tables, as if the world itself depended on it. Edward stood frozen. It was strange. He'd spent his whole life chasing power, and yet, this moment, watching one humble man feed the hungry, felt more powerful than anything he'd ever done. He wanted to walk in right then, to say thank you, to offer help. But pride still whispered in his ear, "What if he doesn't want to see you? What if it's too late?" He turned away, took a few steps, then stopped. A woman nearby, holding a little girl, stumbled and dropped her food. Edward bent down immediately, helping her pick it up. She smiled weakly. "Thank you," he smiled back. "You're welcome." The little girl looked up at him. "Are you one of the helpers too?" He paused for a moment, then nodded. "Not yet," he said softly. "But I think I will be." He crossed the street, heart pounding. Every step felt heavier, but also lighter, the kind of weight that heals when carried. When he reached the door of the community center, he stopped again. He could hear the laughter inside, the clatter of plates, the sound of life happening. He took a deep breath and whispered, "Okay, no more running." Then he opened the door. The car ride home was quiet. Too quiet. The driver tried to make small talk, but Edward barely responded. He just watched the city slide past his window, buildings, crowds, lights. The same streets he had once ruled from above now looked unfamiliar. It was as if he had stepped into a world that had gone on without him. When the car stopped in front of Kane Tower, the doorman rushed forward, eager to please. Kane, glad to see you back, sir. We heard about the—" Edward raised a hand gently. "It's fine. Thank you." The man nodded, stepping aside as Edward entered the lobby. The marble floors gleamed. The air smelled of money and control, and yet something inside him recoiled. He used to love this place. Now it felt hollow, like walking through a museum of his own pride. When the elevator doors opened to his penthouse, he hesitated before stepping inside. The memory hit him like a punch. The broken glass, the sound of his own body hitting the floor, the coldness of the marble beneath his hands. He could still see the faint stain of red wine where it had spilled that night, a dark reminder of who he'd been. He stood there for a long time, staring. The apartment was spotless now, cleaned by staff while he was gone, but no amount of polish could erase what had happened in that room. He walked slowly to the counter and placed his hand on it, the same spot where he had fallen. His reflection stared back from the glossy surface, and for the first time, he couldn't look himself in the eye. He turned away, pacing through the silence. The city lights below blinked like 1,000 unspoken truths. He could still hear Ethan's voice, calm, forgiving. He could still see his mother's eyes in that TV interview, the gentleness, the faith. And he thought, that's the kind of wealth I never had. He sat on the couch and leaned forward, elbows on his knees. His hands trembled slightly, not from weakness this time, but from the weight of realization. For years, he had measured success in numbers, as if profit could prove purpose. Now he saw how empty those numbers were, figures that couldn't buy meaning, digits that couldn't heal loneliness. He closed his eyes and remembered his son again, Daniel. It had been 3 years since they spoke. 3 years since that last fight, when Daniel had said, "Dad, you don't know how to love anyone who can't make you richer." At the time, Edward had called it disrespect. Now he saw it for what it was, truth. He reached for his phone, scrolled through his contacts until he found his son's name. He hovered over the call button, then stopped. He wasn't ready for forgiveness yet. Not until he learned how to give it first. That night he couldn't sleep. The city hummed below him, but his penthouse felt colder than ever. He walked through the hallways, rooms full of furniture that no one used, paintings worth millions that didn't move his heart anymore. He had built a palace and turned it into a prison. He stood by the window and whispered, "God, why me? Why save me?" The answer wasn't loud. It came in silence, in memory, in conviction. Maybe it wasn't about being saved. Maybe it was about being sent back to fix what he'd broken. The next morning, Edward woke up early. He didn't call his chauffeur, didn't put on a suit. He wore jeans and a plain shirt, clothes he hadn't worn in years. He walked to the elevator, pressed the ground floor, and stepped outside into the city air. People brushed past him, delivery riders, construction workers, street vendors. For the first time, he didn't see them as background. He saw them as souls, each carrying their own weight, each living stories he'd never cared to know. He bought a coffee from a street cart. The man behind the counter recognized him immediately. "Hey, aren't you Edward Kane, the finance guy?" Edward smiled faintly. "I used to be," the man laughed. "Used to be? That's funny." Edward took the cup, nodding. "Not really. Just honest." As he walked through the streets, he thought of Ethan's project, Bread for Souls. He had the address from the TV segment. A small community center in the Lower East Side. Nothing fancy, no logos. Just people feeding people. He stopped outside, watching from across the street. It was Saturday morning. A line of men and women stretched down the sidewalk, homeless, single mothers, kids with empty eyes. Volunteers handed out food, laughing softly, moving with purpose. And there he was, Ethan, smiling, serving, wiping tables, as if the world itself depended on it. Edward stood frozen. It was strange. He'd spent his whole life chasing power, and yet, this moment, watching one humble man feed the hungry, felt more powerful than anything he'd ever done. He wanted to walk in right then, to say thank you, to offer help. But pride still whispered in his ear, "What if he doesn't want to see you? What if it's too late?" He turned away, took a few steps, then stopped. A woman nearby, holding a little girl, stumbled and dropped her food. Edward bent down immediately, helping her pick it up. She smiled weakly. "Thank you," he smiled back. "You're welcome." The little girl looked up at him. "Are you one of the helpers too?" He paused for a moment, then nodded. "Not yet," he said softly. "But I think I will be." He crossed the street, heart pounding. Every step felt heavier, but also lighter, the kind of weight that heals when carried. When he reached the door of the community center, he stopped again. He could hear the laughter inside, the clatter of plates, the sound of life happening. He took a deep breath and whispered, "Okay, no more running." Then he opened the door. The moment Edward stepped inside, the smell of bread and soup filled the air. It wasn't just food, it was warmth, the kind that money couldn't buy. Laughter echoed from the kitchen, mixed with the clatter of pots and the shuffle of busy feet. The place was alive. He stood near the doorway, watching for a moment. Volunteers moved in rhythm, smiling, chatting, handing out meals to a line that seemed endless. No luxury, no spotlight. Just service. And then he saw him, Ethan. The young man was wearing a simple gray shirt, sleeves rolled up, hair damp with sweat. He was laughing with an older woman, helping her lift a pot onto the counter. There was no bitterness in him, no trace of arrogance. Just peace, the kind that comes from knowing exactly why you wake up every morning. Edward froze. He'd rehearsed 1,000 ways this meeting could go. In all of them, he spoke first. Now he couldn't find a single word. Ethan turned around, and for a moment, time stopped. Recognition flickered across his face, surprise, then quiet understanding. Arcane?" he said softly. His voice wasn't sharp, just curious. Edward nodded. I hope I'm not interrupting." Ethan shook his head. "No, sir. Everyone's welcome here." He smiled, not with sarcasm, not with pity, just kindness. That made it even harder. Edward stepped closer, his voice unsteady. "I came to say thank you." "And to apologize." Ethan tilted his head. "For what?" Edward exhaled slowly. "For everything. For the way I spoke to you. For treating you like less than human. For thinking that money gave me the right to look down on someone better than me." The room grew quieter. Even the background noise seemed to fade. Ethan didn't rush to answer. He looked at the man in front of him, the same man who once threw money at his feet, and saw something different now. Not pride, not power, just a heart learning how to bend. He placed a hand on Edward's shoulder. "You don't owe me an apology," he said gently. "You already paid it, the night you lived." Edward blinked, confused. "I don't understand." Ethan smiled faintly. "Sometimes surviving is the debt. You got another chance to live right. That's worth more than any sorry." Edward felt his throat tighten. "I don't know how to do that," he whispered. "How to live right. I've spent my life chasing everything except meaning." Ethan nodded. "Then start small. Feed someone who can't pay you back. Listen to someone who doesn't matter to your business. Forgive someone who never said sorry." He looked around the room at the people working beside him. "This place taught me that. Grace doesn't need an audience. It just needs hands willing to help." Edward's eyes filled again. He looked at the line of people being served, faces worn by time and hardship, but still carrying sparks of gratitude. He turned back to Ethan. "Let me help you. Not as charity, as partnership. You've been feeding bodies. Maybe I can help you feed more souls." Ethan studied him for a moment. There was sincerity in his eyes, the kind you can't fake. "All right," Ethan said softly, "but if you're going to help, do it quietly. No press, no cameras, no Kane Foundation banner." Edward nodded immediately. "I don't want recognition. I want redemption." Ethan smiled. "Then you'll fit right in." One of the volunteers called out from the kitchen. "Ethan, we need more hands with the soup." Ethan laughed. "Always." He looked at Edward. "Come on, you good with a ladle?" Edward hesitated, then smiled awkwardly. "Never used one in my life." "Then it's a good day to start." Ethan handed him an apron and a ladle. Edward slipped the apron over his shirt, feeling ridiculous and strangely free. As he stepped behind the counter, a woman approached with her tray. Her clothes were torn, her eyes tired, but when Edward handed her the bowl, she smiled like he'd given her gold. He felt something shift inside him, a warmth that had nothing to do with soup. It was purpose, something he hadn't felt in decades. Hours passed and he didn't notice. He served, cleaned, carried boxes, refilled trays. For the first time in his adult life, no one called him sir. No one asked for his signature. And he didn't miss it. When the last person left and the doors closed, Ethan leaned against the counter, exhausted but content. Edward joined him, wiping his hands on a towel. Ethan looked at him and said quietly, "You did good today." Edward smiled. "I feel like I should have done this years ago." Ethan nodded. "Most people wait for miracles, but sometimes we're supposed to be them." Edward looked down, thinking about how close he'd come to dying, how easily pride had nearly killed him, and how mercy had shown up on a motorcycle that night. He said softly, "You were my miracle, Ethan." Ethan smiled, shaking his head. "Maybe, but the truth is, you were meant to live. Now you just have to decide what for." They stood in silence for a moment, the hum of the city seeping in through the walls. Then Edward took a deep breath. "All right," he said. "Where do we start?" Ethan handed him a loaf of bread from the counter. "Here," he said simply. "Start by breaking this." Edward held the bread, looked at it, and smiled. It wasn't a fortune. It wasn't an empire. But it was a beginning. Weeks turned into months. The headlines that once carried Edward Kane's name had moved on to other men, other fortunes, other noise. And for the first time in his life, he didn't mind being forgotten. Every Saturday morning, while the city still yawned awake, Edward walked through the same narrow streets where Bread for Souls had begun. He wore the same gray apron as everyone else. No chauffeur, no designer coat. Just a man with sleeves rolled up and a heart learning how to give. He had become part of the rhythm, the laughter, the noise, the scraping of pots. Sometimes new volunteers didn't even know who he was, and that was exactly how he wanted it. He was a different kind of wealthy now. Not in currency, but in peace. The kind that comes when you stop building walls and start building tables. Every week, he'd arrive early, set up chairs, cut bread, and greet people by name. He'd ask about their kids, their jobs, their stories. He listened more than he spoke. And when he did speak, it was never about himself. Once, a volunteer asked, "You used to be someone important, right?" Edward smiled. "I still am," he said, just in a different way. Behind the scenes, though, he had become Bread for Souls' biggest supporter. Every month, anonymous donations appeared in the charity's account, enough to expand their work into new boroughs, to build a van that could serve meals across the city, to buy new stoves and supplies. Ethan knew the truth, of course, but he never mentioned it. They had an unspoken agreement. Kindness didn't need credit. One rainy afternoon, as the volunteers packed up, Ethan noticed Edward standing near the door, watching a young boy finish his meal. The child looked up and waved. Edward smiled back, and the boy ran over, holding out a small drawing, a stick figure serving food to a line of people, a sun shining above them. "It's you," the boy said proudly. "My mom says people like you make God smile." Edward knelt, taking the paper gently. "Well, tell your mom she's right about God, but I think he's smiling at you too." The boy laughed and ran off. Edward folded the drawing carefully and placed it in his pocket, right next to Ethan's note from the hospital. As the room emptied, Ethan approached. "Still can't believe you show up every week," he said. "Most people in your world donate once and disappear." Edward chuckled softly. "I used to think money was the most expensive thing to give. Turns out, it's time." "And humility," Ethan nodded. "Funny how those two things buy peace." Edward looked around at the tables, the volunteers cleaning up, the laughter still echoing in the corners. "I used to build towers," he said quietly. "Now I build places where people eat, and somehow this feels higher." A few weeks later, Bread for Souls launched a new initiative, mobile kitchens that traveled to neighborhoods too far to reach before. Ethan asked Edward to come along for the first run. They drove through the Bronx, stopping at shelters, parks, alleys, anywhere people gathered hungry and forgotten. The rain followed them, but it didn't matter. They were warm in purpose. At one stop, a woman asked Edward, "Why do you do this? You look like someone who doesn't need to." He paused, thinking of all the reasons: guilt, gratitude, redemption. But in the end, he just smiled. "Because once someone fed me when I didn't deserve it," the woman smiled back. "Then you understand," he nodded. "I think I finally do." Later that night, they parked the van by the river, watching the city lights ripple across the dark water. Ethan leaned against the railing, arms crossed. "You ever miss it?" he asked. "The old life?" Edward thought for a moment. "The noise, maybe. The meetings. The rush. The illusion that I mattered more than I did." He shook his head, smiling faintly. "No, Ethan, I don't miss it. That life fed my ego, not my soul. This feeds both." Ethan smiled. "You've changed more than most people ever will." Edward chuckled. "I think I just remembered who I was supposed to be all along." As they stood in silence, a gentle breeze carried the smell of bread from the van. The night was calm. The city lights danced on the surface of the river like 1,000 quiet prayers. Edward closed his eyes and whispered, "Thank you for letting me stay long enough to learn." It wasn't a prayer for survival anymore. It was a prayer of gratitude, for mercy, for second chances, for the strange grace of being humbled. When he returned home that night, he didn't take the elevator to the penthouse. He stopped at the lobby instead, sat in one of the chairs meant for guests, and watched people come and go. He used to walk past them without seeing their faces. Now he saw stories, each person carrying invisible battles, each one deserving a kind word. He thought about how easily he'd once thrown money on the floor, and how hard it had been to pick up compassion afterward. He smiled to himself. The weight he carried now was lighter, but far more meaningful. He whispered quietly, "Sometimes the richest life is the one that doesn't look rich at all." And for the first time in years, he slept peacefully. A year passed. Seasons changed. And the city that once only worshipped speed began to slow down, if only in the quiet corners where compassion was baked fresh every morning. Bread for Souls had grown beyond what anyone imagined. What started as a few volunteers in a small kitchen had become a movement: mobile vans, community hubs, and small bakeries run by people who once stood in line for food. Now they were the ones serving. Feeding others had become a way to heal themselves. Ethan Morales still led with the same calm smile. He didn't care about recognition. He cared about people. He said that was enough. And every Saturday, without fail, a familiar man arrived early, rolled up his sleeves, and started cutting bread before the rest of the volunteers arrived. Edward Kane, the man who once owned towers, now washed soup pots. And somehow he looked richer than ever. Inside the main hall of the new center, a mural covered the wall. Painted in bright colors, it showed hands passing bread from one person to another, a chain of giving that seemed endless. At the bottom, written in simple letters, were the words that had shaped the mission. Never deny bread, even to the ungrateful. Ethan had chosen that phrase for the mural, but he never told anyone where it came from. Only Edward knew. Every time he walked by it, he smiled quietly. On a spring afternoon, the center was hosting a small celebration, a year since the first mobile kitchen had launched. Volunteers and families filled the space. Laughter, music, the smell of bread baking, the sound of life restored. Edward stood by the serving table, watching a young woman teach her little daughter how to ladle soup. He caught himself smiling. He hadn't realized it before, but this was what peace looked like. Not applause, not legacy. Just joy shared in small moments. Ethan walked over, carrying a tray of fresh rolls. "You're early again," he said. Edward grinned. "Old habits die hard," Ethan laughed. "Funny, I used to say that about arrogance," Edward chuckled. "Still true. But I'm in recovery." They both laughed, and for a moment, silence settled between them, the kind of silence that feels like friendship. Ethan looked around the crowded room. "You ever think about how it all started?" Edward nodded slowly. "Every day. A wrong order. A cruel word. A fall. And a mercy I didn't deserve." He looked at Ethan, his voice soft. "Funny how grace works. It never knocks, it just walks in through the same door you slammed shut." Ethan smiled. "Yeah, and sometimes it delivers burgers." They both laughed again, the sound blending with the chatter around them. Later that evening, after the celebration ended, Edward stayed behind to help clean up. He wiped down tables, stacked chairs, and finally sat alone for a moment, looking at the mural glowing in the soft light. He reached into his jacket and took out the folded note, the same one Ethan had written in the hospital. The ink had faded, but the words were still clear. "Take care of yourself. Life doesn't give us many chances to start again." He smiled, whispered to himself, "I did, Ethan, and I think I finally started." He folded the note again, placed it back in his pocket, and stood up. Outside, the night was quiet. A gentle wind moved through the trees. Across the street, a homeless man sat against a wall. A small dog curled beside him. Edward crossed the road, handed him a paper bag with food, and said softly, "Dinner's on me tonight." The man looked up, surprised. "Why?" Edward smiled. "Because once someone did the same for me." The man nodded, a tear glinting in the corner of his eye. "God bless you." Edward looked at him and said, "He already has." He walked back toward the center, the mural's colors still glowing faintly through the windows. Above it, the words seemed to shimmer in the light. "Never deny bread, even to the ungrateful," he whispered to himself, "because grace doesn't check credentials." He looked up at the night sky, the same one he used to ignore from his penthouse, the same stars that now felt closer somehow. He breathed in the cool air, the smell of bread and rain mixing in the breeze. For a long time he just stood there, a man no longer rich by the world's measure, but overflowing with something eternal. As he walked home, the city lights shimmered like blessings scattered across the streets. Each one a reminder that mercy doesn't need grand gestures, just hearts willing to start again. The narrator's voice softened, carrying the message like a prayer. In a world hungry for pride, a man once learned that the richest meal is mercy. And sometimes, God lets us fall to our knees, not to punish us, but to teach us who really lifts us up.